Welcome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Jane Josom. I'm the Museum Director and CEO of the Jewish Holocaust Centre in Melbourne, Australia. Currently being rebuilt, you can see the image behind me. And it's great to see so many people joining us and coming from far and wide to celebrate and launch Frances Prince's book, Gift of Time. A gift to not only her amazing father, my colleague and friend David Prince, but a gift for us all. And a gift, and another COVID silver lining, and we must celebrate this. I want to extend a warm welcome to David Prince and all your extended family, your mishpacha, and to all Holocaust survivors joining us tonight. I'm broadcasting from the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their long history, unique culture, and time-honoured traditions, and to their elders past, present, and emerging. And wherever you are, I ask you to think about the people who came before. Think about injustices and human rights. Acknowledging is the first step of righting wrongs and creating an atmosphere of trust and hope for the future. Now, just last week, I came across a quote from American educator and reformer William Gardner. He said, "History never looks like history when you're living through it." And last March, when Frances first conceived the idea to read a book with her father, they both had no idea that we were on the precipice of a historical event, one we're still immersed in. Her father, David, one of our much loved and valued museum guides, had lived through the most tumultuous and tragic time in recent history. In March last year, a tiny virus sent us into home isolation. Well, that little virus grew some serious legs. And here we are almost 18 months later, some of us still locked down. And yes, we have the dubious honour here in Melbourne of being the most locked down city in the world, but I'm grateful for that in some ways, as our elderly are among the most vulnerable, and keeping David and other survivors isolated has meant that they're still very much with us and safe from exposure to this deadly virus. Now, Frances's book, Gift of Time, is in fact an incredible artifact of the historic moment we're currently experiencing, not just a record of a special time she shared with her survivor father, but a precious document recording his reflections on the historic time that he had experienced. And what I valued most about this work was not just the insights Frances uncovered through the exercise of reading to David, the memories it awoke in David, some of which he had not shared before. There are many layers to this book, and the special relationship between a father and his daughter shines through. But what I loved most, as will those of us who know David, is how brilliantly Frances has captured his personality and demeanour. For the last 18 months, I and my colleagues have missed seeing David every week, always immaculately dressed in his jacket, often his black and white check jacket, always inquiring after my family, and often with something he wanted to share with me. I miss seeing David like I miss all my survivor friends. And reading your book, Frances, I felt I was with him again. So tonight, friends, you will be enlightened by a conversation. We're privileged to have author and playwright Joanna Murray-Smith leading the conversation with Frances. But first, let me share with you a video created by my colleagues setting the scene for us. Thank you.
Sitting with Frances while she read to me gave me the opportunity to spend time with my daughter. Precious time together. It gave me the opportunity to tell her more about myself from my younger days. Frances already knew quite a bit about my life when I was a child in Poland, what happened to me during the war and my years of studying in Munich after the war. But there were things she didn't know. And so now, while on the couch together, I was able to share so much more. She asked me many questions about events that I have not thought about it over 70 years. The way that I look at some of those days is very different from how I understood them the time when it happened. Frances read so many books to me, so many Jewish childhoods, so many Holocaust sufferings, and then the beginning of new life. It has been wonderful that the time I have spent with Frances resulted in her writing a book, and I am proud of her. Ella, my wife, Frances's mother, would also have been very proud. And now I hope that you, the readers, will also enjoy learning something about my life.
Hello everyone. I'm absolutely thrilled to be launching Gift of Time, Discoveries from the Daily Ritual of Reading with my Father. I'd like to invite you all to join us onto our metaphoric couch. There's always room for more people to share a very short reading from Gift of Time. This particular extract grew out of us reading about the Jewish survivor students who studied at prestigious German universities in the years immediately after the Second World War. This all took place in Germany. Both my parents, Dad, David Prince, and my late mother, Rachel Salzburg Prince, Zichrona Livracha, were part of this amazing cohort of young people. For those of you who may have the book, please, if you want to follow, join me on page 24. We continue reading about specific survivor students. I want Dad to tell me about them all. He remembers some very clearly. This is especially so for people he has remained in sporadic contact with over the decades. Even more so for people he has met up with at the group's reunions in America and Israel in the 1980s and 1990s. Some names draw a complete blank. Others ring a bell of vague familiarity. Of course, I want him to remember in detail everything about all these people. I am acutely aware of how unreasonable this is. Dad interrupts. Say that name again. Lydia Eichenholz. I reread very slowly. I think she is the person who introduced me to your mother. What? I bellow. He says, I can't be sure, but I think so. I retort with, tell me more, like the song Summer Nights in the musical Grease. Well, we were in the Jewish student cafeteria. That was the place where we all met up between classes. It's where we ate, socialised and flirted. Mum was sitting with another girl, Lydia, I think. I'm not sure how I knew her. Anyway, Lydia introduced me to Mum, briefly. At a later time, Mum told me that Lydia said to her that I was a really nice boy and that she, Lydia herself, might be interested in going out with me. I am gobsmacked and a little overwhelmed. I find myself cheering on my mum in this Mum versus Lydia competition, as if my life depends on it, which it actually does. Thank you. Our reading project actually began with one particular book in mind, a masterpiece of a book that told the story in great detail of these survivor university students. This book, The New Life, Jewish Students of Post-War Germany by Jeremy Varon, Professor of History at the New School for Social Research in New York. This precious text contains the details of what was probably the most significant period in my parents' lives. In Munich, Germany, in the late 1940s, where they, together with other Jewish youngsters, became university students in the most unlikely of circumstances. Professor Varon's study is the only one that I have ever found. And believe me, I have looked. I will be forever grateful to him, to you, Jeremy, for your scholarship and resultant book, for your generosity in writing the afterword to my book, Gift of Time, and for your friendship. And now I invite you all to meet, so to speak, Professor Jeremy Varon and share in a brief history lesson.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Varon, a professor of history at the New School in New York, coming to you today from Brooklyn. Let me first say what an honor it is to celebrate the publication of Francis Prince's remarkable book, Gift of Time. The greater honor, however, has been playing a role in its conception. To explain, I myself wrote a book on a subset of Holocaust survivors, young, mostly Polish Jews who studied in German universities just after the end of World War II. Francis's father, David, was part of that cohort, though I did not connect with him during my research. It was only through serendipity, or perhaps kismet, that I finally met the Prince family. Francis discovered my book years after it came out, reading it with her father during COVID lockdown. It served as a touchstone both for his memories and a rich dialogue between father and daughter, which Francis chronicled in the style of a diary. The day I learned in an email from her that all this was happening was among the happiest I can remember. Gift of Time is in ways a deeply personal book that touches on an important, if little known, dimension of Jewish history. I'd like to say a bit here about where the student cohort and David fit within that history and why it matters. I'll conclude with some additional appreciations of Francis's book. So then, my book is a part of what has been called post-Holocaust history, which I'll elaborate with reference to some images, so allow me to share my screen. For decades, death and destruction rightly dominated our understanding of the Holocaust. We are all familiar with images like this one of survival at death's door. I'll show it for just a second, as it is so painful. Indeed, it was long assumed that the Holocaust received its closure with liberation for the lucky few, rendering everything else more or less a postscript. Even most Holocaust scholars had only a vague sense that some survivors wound up in the United States, others made it to Israel, and some even resettled in Australia. But that passage was largely mysterious, as was the larger drama by which survivors gained again a sense of power and a positive vision of their future. Around 2000, this began to change. That year, there was a landmark conference hosted by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum titled Life Reborn, Jewish Displaced Persons 1945 to 1951, when up to 300,000 Jewish refugees lived under Allied occupation in Germany. The conference explored the agency Jews asserted, most often confined in refugee camps. And here pictured are the dominant tropes of Jewish revival. First, the literal regeneration of the Jewish people, indicated by proud mothers and their babies. Second, the renewed practice of Judaism as a religion, signified by the Torah scrolls you see. And third, the revival of Jewish political life, which overwhelmingly meant agitation for a Jewish state in Palestine. All of these thrived in the refugee camps in what has been called the last fluorescence of an otherwise vanished East European Jewish culture. In this world of refugees were 700 or so young Jews intent on studying in German universities, mostly in Munich, where David studied. Though a part of Jewish life, they mostly stood outside its dominant narratives. Very few married or had children while in Germany, so as not to interrupt their studies. They were in the main urban secular intellectuals and not highly observant. Finally, though they all supported a Jewish state, they resisted pressure from Jewish authorities to abandon their studies and become pioneers in Israel. These are the images of their lives. First, we see a meeting of their student union in a university auditorium. Here we see a cluster of students outside their modest but beloved kosher cafeteria, where they studied, socialized, and enjoyed time away from their German classmates. This is in fact where Francis's parents, Ella and David, met and began their courtship. And here we see a small group of students hiking in the Bavarian Alps with the infamous Eagle's Nest lair of the vanquished Hitler in the background. Some of the students shown here were close friends of David, described in Francis's book. The photo, I should say, was given to me by medical student in Munich, Sabina Zimmering, who sadly died about a month ago at age 98 in her adoptive home of Minneapolis, where she became an eye doctor. Finally, here is a page of their newspaper printed in multiple languages. It is called The New Life, symbolized with this lovely image of a sun rising over an open book. Indeed, David Prince wrote a very moving essay included in France's book on his time in a forced labor camp in the newspaper's second issue. Now, at a personal level, being a student was so vital to their rebirth. Many had been academically gifted as children. To become a student again, to learn again, was to reconnect with a defining passion and assert at an individual level continuity in the face of enormous rupture. To train for a profession, in addition, was to have a calling card in an uncertain world. But the students also had a sense of mission larger than their own lives. Jewish identity, they argued, was powerfully defined by intellectual pursuits and high degrees of educational and professional achievement. As students, they sought to sustain Jewish traditions of learning and thereby defy the destructive power of the Holocaust itself. The chain had been broken, one student said, so they had to become again that chain. After leaving Germany, the lives they made for themselves as doctors, dentists, engineers, academics, and authors are testament to that resilience as a collective attribute, reviving shared Jewish legacies. Which brings me at last back to Francis and her book. It reads like no tendered work of a well-meaning amateur. Rather, it is an extremely sophisticated and accomplished book about the ruin of the past and what it means to win a better future. It is, in short, a shining example of the very traditions of Jewish learning and literary reflection that her father and his fellow students worked so hard to preserve. For that, Francis and David can be immensely proud, and all of us can be immensely grateful. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Both those who are geographically close by and welcome to those who are geographically far away. I welcome you all to the launch of Gift of Time in real time. I am speaking live from East St Kilda in Melbourne. It is my pleasure, honour and absolute thrill to introduce Australia's foremost playwright, Joanna Murray Smith. In reality, Joanna doesn't really need an introduction as such, but in admiration of her astonishing talent, success, and contribution to our cultural lives, I would like to say something about her literary creations. Way back from Joanna's first play, Angry Penguins, which Stephen, my husband, and I saw in 1987 in the long defunct Church Theatre, to her most recent play, Berlin, which was staged by Melbourne Theatre Company earlier this year, which luckily got squeezed in between all our lockdowns. Joanna has written and brought to the stage over 25 plays, 3 novels, libretti, screenplays for films and TV series, newspaper columns, and more. After watching or reading or experiencing any of Joanna's creations, one is always, but always riveted by her extraordinary skill as a razor-sharp wordsmith. One is always pushed towards examining one's own life, relationships, and the broader human condition. And not to put too fine a point on it, one often walks out feeling not very comfortable, which I think may be Joanna's whole point. Her plays have been performed not only in Australia, but been produced around the world, including on Broadway and the West End and the National Theatre in London. Now, you are probably wondering why on earth would a playwright, author, and screenwriter of Joanna's stature want to be conducting an in conversation with me? There is a one-word answer, and that word in Yiddish is mishpucha. In Hebrew, it is mishpacha, and in English, it is family. We are family. To be precise, we are related through Stephen's side of our family, but that's okay, and that's another story. There really is no other reason for Joanna to be here and accept my invitation to launch Gift of Time, and to accept my invitation before she even read the book. So I thank you, Joanna, from the bottom of my heart for your enthusiastic generosity in launching Gift of Time. If we were all present in a bricks and mortar venue, I have no doubt that there would now be a spontaneous standing ovation for you. Welcome, Joanna Murray-Smith.
Well, thank you so much, Frances. I'm a bit embarrassed about that introduction, and I can assure you that that agreeing to launch the book was no risk at all. Having known you, I had no doubt at all that it was going to be a really extraordinary book. It's an enormous pleasure and privilege to have the opportunity to welcome you all here, in quotation marks, to celebrate Frances's book. And I send my particular love to David. I've known Frances for a good portion of my life, both as part of a wide web of family, as she mentioned, that revolves around Judy Colt, a beloved almost aunt to my brother, sister, and I, and Frances's mother-in-law. Would that I have had Judy as my mother-in-law. I can say that when nobody's looking. Our families somehow have retained the warmth and connection from Passover to Passover, despite that great divider. No, not just football teams, the Yarra River. Those Passover dinners have allowed me to watch Frances and her husband Stephen raise 2 beautiful boys, now far flung across the hemispheres. Some time ago, I helped to launch Judy's extraordinary Holocaust memoir, Tell It to the Squirrels, a profound, compelling, and beautifully written book. And lo and behold, the writing bug has now been caught by Frances, who has turned an incidental time passer in the age of COVID into another profound meditation on time, tragedy, and survival with this book. Without more ado, I would like to ask Frances some questions to tease out some of the layers of this very unusual and deeply affecting approach to investigating history. Frances, it seems to me that this book contains 2 stories or strands. The first is the story of the survivor students, the small group of Jewish students who studied in Germany after the war, and the stories of your parents' life and experiences. The second strand is in the present, and the story of a daughter and father forming a partnership in cross-generational understanding, and to some extent, sharing a quest to uncover and elucidate a particular period of history through the lens of a witness and participant, the survival of whom led, in fact, to your own existence. You write, Dad and I are immersed together in a wonderful time machine journey into my parents' youthful lives. And you write at the start, just a couple of short years before enrolling in university, most of these young people had been starving in German concentration camps, hidden in attics and cellars, or living with false identities, fearing imminent discovery. Deep-seated terror had been at the centre of their lives. Now, one of the most striking things about the book is the blending of a personal, euphoric period for your father and mother, which incorporated freedom from the suffering, obviously, of the war, which was now over, the fun of the Jewish Students' Union, the discovery of love and courting your mother, and the beginning and development of friendships, which have lasted a lifetime. And alongside that, the retrospective understanding of what long shadows still existed for Jews in Germany so soon after the war. You acknowledge what your father went through, but the dominant emotion you convey is the joy of this time, despite the fact that the war had ended only 20 months before. How do you make sense of that? Was it just the relief of the pain being over, or was it an unconscious or conscious determination to not look back, to wrestle some happiness from the moment? Can you talk about that? And were you also surprised by how positive your father was about that period?
Okay, thanks, Joanna. As usual, your insightful comments make one think and think deeply. First of all, there's always with one's own parents, there's a degree of taking something for granted. We grow up hearing stories, and like all of us, they sort of get stuck sometimes as tropes. You keep hearing the same thing, and perhaps it requires us to get a bit older and more mature to actually try and examine, what are they really, really saying? I think a big part of it, and both my parents always acknowledged it, is that they were the right age for all this to be happening. They were the right university age. They were ready chronologically to enter university, even if scholastically they were far from ready. And I think that's part of it. I think the joie de vivre of being older teenagers. I think that quest for life and living and for joy and for loss was greater at that age.
Yeah.
And it's not for all of them, by far not.
Yes.
And I think that's part of it. I think their age and resilience at that age has got a lot to do with that joy that I was very aware of all my life.
Fantastic. Absolutely. Totally can see that. Now, central to this contrast between the happiness at university and the catastrophe so recently experienced is the notion that sometimes the most terrible of circumstances allows wonderful things to happen. You write, it is obvious that my parents never ever would have met had their worlds not been destroyed and the remnants reshuffled. Very powerful and very moving thought that out of this terrible, terrible circumstance, this beautiful beginning of a love affair and ultimately a family came. When did this unique experience of Holocaust survivors, many of whom embraced hope and happiness and made new lives, but could still not completely shrug off the wounds of the war, when did that legacy become evident to you growing up? That all the love and prosperity of home was built on this trauma?
Okay. With that question, I actually need to, in that sense, separate my parents in their reactions. So my father is and always has been a more optimistic, I guess, sunnier personality than my late mother was. I think part of it is that is a person predisposed in a certain way, whatever life throws at them, or is someone what they're like because of the circumstances? And obviously we can never know. So it's hard sort of to know where joyfulness comes in. And I think, and also with my parents, just, you know, you can't generalize. People had very different experiences during the war. And those, I mean, obviously, Joanna, you, but those who've read the book, my father's war experience and my mother's was very, very different, objectively speaking, let alone how they internalized and interpreted and then lived with it. But the objective experience was very, very different.
So are
And,
you
yeah.
saying that, are you saying that your awareness of the past came more through your mother than your father?
No, it came from both of them. It's what awareness of what? There's awareness of what they went through. There's awareness of the psychological impact on their lives. So there's so many layers of awareness. And I just want to take a little issue with something you said earlier, when you said about dreadful things happening and then this joy comes out. Even though I know you're talking about my life, I wouldn't be here if there hadn't been a war, because my parents never would have met because they came from different cities, different social classes, and so on. I have to say, nothing was worth what happened. It doesn't matter. It's my life I'm talking about, and I realize I'm implying I shouldn't be here, but perhaps I shouldn't be here for what happened then. There is no, in my view, recompense. There is joy to be gained. There's resilience, but it's a purpose. I don't know if you're insinuating or that or not. There is no such.
I
not
think
a purpose, but that, you know, you had to have gone through this to have enjoyed that. And maybe I buy that perhaps about other things. Never the Holocaust, ever. No,
I think, no, I certainly didn't mean to imply that, but it was really more the growing up with a sense of the irony, a kind of embedded sense of irony, that out of this terrible thing, you know, beautiful things came, including your own children.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, I accept that very much what you're saying. And I think, not that I want to necessarily go down this path in our conversation, I think it's very much a thing that children of survivors carry. We know we're not meant to be alive.
Yeah.
We are not meant to be here. And that's part of growing up as a second generation, so to speak, is the title. And different people of my generation deal with that in different ways.
And there've been many great books written on that very subject.
Yes.
Now, speaking of survivors, your parents experienced the darkest aspects of the war. Your father had been in the Lodz ghetto, Auschwitz, and the labour camp Friedland. Your mother, you write, was in a class of suffering way beyond not just Dad's, but most people's. She endured years in the Warsaw ghetto and only survived a ghetto uprising by jumping out of the 4th story of a burning building. She went on to a death camp and then 18 months in Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, which allows your father to make the extraordinary claim that he, quote, didn't really suffer all that much, implied by comparison. Although this pretty much goes unsaid in their marriage, you write. My mother arrived in Melbourne in 1939, and although she escaped, so to speak, almost everyone she and her brother and parents knew in their village was subsequently murdered. Growing up, I didn't consider my mother a survivor. But the older I get, the more I do, because so much of her character, I think, was shaped by those first 11 years of her life. Now, you write, in the years after the war, many of those who had avoided the concentration camps didn't consider themselves, nor were they considered by others to be Holocaust survivors. This broader and more encompassing definition was decades away. Why do you think that this definition has altered? And are there any other major shifts in perspective re the Holocaust that you've noticed in your own lifetime?
Okay, thank you. They're wonderful questions. And especially, I guess, as an educator for so many years, they're very important questions on that level as well. I think, first of all, it's like self-definition. It's not like historians came and said, you're in this category, you're a survivor, you're not survivor. It was a self-definition. And I think the most, I don't know if the word is potent or most visible aspect of Jews when upon liberation were those who were in the camps. It's what the American newsreel shows. It's what the liberating armed forces whether it's the Russians, the Americans, whoever, saw. So that was the image. This is where the Jews were, those who are still left. So I think that's part, so perhaps it was partly imposed upon them who is a survivor. And as I made clear, that term survivor is not used in any parlance till later. And I think what happened then, and it sort of as Jews came out of other places, not just the camps, whether it was from the Soviet Union, those in hiding in different places, those living under false identities, those as partisans, as they came up, there was this, I call it a pecking order, if you like. It's a competition in the suffering stakes. And I know that sounds ugly. And I'm not sure if I would have spoken in that way even 20 years ago. But I think it was self-defined. And people looked at each other and compared their stories. And it seems that the ghetto concentration camp route became, if you like, the template. And anything compared to that was something other. Yeah. It wasn't a picnic, but everything, that seemed to be the apex of suffering, if you like. And so everything became compared to that. And I think there's perhaps with the passage of time, the knowledge of what it meant to be living under false papers, of what it meant to be hiding in a monastery or a convent, pretending not to be Jewish as a child. You know, what all those experiences, yes, perhaps physically they weren't going through what people were, but emotionally, psychologically, what did that mean to be walking down the street and hoping if someone recognized you or suspected you, what could happen? I think those aspects were not recognized, both by survivors and scholars as well, till later.
Yeah.
And as I, yes, sorry.
No, it's fascinating. Yeah.
And also then you have, you know, when does the war start? Is it 39 to 45?
Yeah.
You know, is it 41 to 45 if you were in the east part of Poland? What about 33 if you lived in Germany? And then Austria. And does it mean Hungary? No one suffered until 1944. So
yes,
it's not
a
simple.
Completely shifting conversation about yeah. I'm going to go on because I want to get to a couple of other things. Let's talk a little bit about your mother. You write quite touchingly about your mother's decision not to go to one of the later reunions, as she was, you speculate, probably intimidated by the fact that the other women there all finished their degrees and became professionals in their fields, which she did not, having come to Australia before her course was concluded in dentistry. And you write, I know that she carried a sense of lost opportunity throughout her life. You go on to talk about your own frustration over that, and your father's frustration with your frustration, that the decision basically belonged to the moment. A lot of small things contributed to when they left, and it wasn't as clear cut as choosing the completion of her degree or not. So they came in December 1949. You write, Dad and I have discussed this problematic for me, in brackets, subject many times before. Why didn't they wait before emigration? It's a question I ask again now. It annoys and aggravates Dad. I know I sound accusatory. It seems like a swiping reproach. Dad is exasperated and responds, we were kids. We weren't experienced. We didn't weigh things up so carefully. Were you very aware of other schisms of understanding between you and your dad, coming from your respective ages and different life experience when you were discussing the past? Were there other places where perhaps having grown up with feminism or growing up in a different era led you to find certain things in your father's life hard to fathom?
It's a wonderful question, wonderful question. I'll just say one thing, that, you know, it's so easy to be critical of our parents, full stop, but critical, I guess, a long time afterwards. And we're also, you know, are we also clever in hindsight and so forth? And what on earth will our kids say about us? We don't even want to go that way. So, you know, that's sort of, I guess, part of my response. I'm very aware of the difference in time. And you've put up the feminism thing as well. I mean, very much so. And it's, I guess it's part of privilege of growing up here in Australia, where, and it's a privileged situation to be able to weigh up and make decisions, you know, and every decision, I can do that. Shall I do this? Shall I do that? All decisions are fine. None of them, I mean, are really life and death decisions. You can sit there and you ruminate and you weigh up and you know, all of that is how I make decisions. I weigh things up carefully because I can. It's not spur of the moment. And sometimes when you're making decisions, I've got 2 or 3 options. They're all good. They're all good. I just want to wait. I want to choose the best of what's good. And I think we have to look back very, very, I guess, very humbly. And it's a totally different circumstance. So yes, I juggle all the time, these layers. Yes, I'm very aware that I'm not reasonable at all in how I look back. But then if you're going to have an honest relationship, you've got to also be able to say, this is driving me nuts. You know, why? And then, you know, my father has had enough of the why. And he's also right. You can, you know, we can both be right coming from different time periods, different upbringings and different genders.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to try and get two more questions in. We'll see how we go for time. But you write wonderfully about the article that your father wrote in Yiddish for the Jewish Students' Union newspaper that you discovered, which is a fantastic and fascinating part of the book. And you had it translated, and your father's piece is incredibly eloquent. And you know, when the foreman tells your father that he has to go back to work with his broken foot, your father tells him it's impossible. He threatens that he will send me back to Gross Rosen or he will shoot me. Do what you like, I tell him. I'm quite broken, both physically and mentally. I feel the last moments of my consciousness are drawing near. You write, we are both overwhelmed. Tears overbrim our eyes, speechless. That's almost all you say about the emotional consequence of diving back into that time. You also write that your father seemed to develop a kind of outsized humility when the books you were reading described heroic actions by some of the writers who wrote the books. And he laments, I did nothing, in this very self-deprecating way. Obviously not deserved, but he clearly felt that as you were reading. Do you feel during the ritual that you had with your dear dad that you were in danger of plumbing feelings too difficult to control in either of you?
Okay, I feel like I need to lie on the back on the couch just to answer your question on that famous couch of mine. Now that I don't think if I don't like it anymore, I even can't get rid of it. But anyway, there were certain things, but I have to say that it wasn't so much on the emotional level, because emotionally I felt I went pretty deep. I think more on things that I don't think he ever thought of perhaps before. Things that I hadn't thought of asking him before.
Yeah.
You know, we think, yes, he lives around the corner, but you know, when's the last time most people would spend hours and hours sitting with their parent when you're sort of our age, they're their age and we're our age. So perhaps things that were sitting on my mind, they've always been there. But I haven't really addressed them with Dad since being an adult with my own children. So I think that they're the things that perhaps were a little difficult for me. There are also some things in reading that perhaps I left out that I didn't think mightn't be interesting for Dad, that might be for me.
Yeah.
Okay, so sometimes I made those sort of choices.
Yes.
With Dad saying, you know, I did nothing, you know, when you're reading about some of the heroics and antics, and that's what Dad sort of starts feeling, oh, I did nothing. But, you know, the war starts, he's 14 years old. He's with his parents. He doesn't have agency in the way that somehow people get separated from their parents. One of the books that we read, the late Emmanuel Tannay's book, he's the same age as Dad. He's born in 1925. So in his book, his parents sent him away out of where he lived, the ghetto, when he was 14, same age as Dad. He was on his own.
Yeah.
Dad's with his parents till they got to Auschwitz. His parents were there to look after him and his brother. That's what parents do, and it's what they did.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when you talk like that, and you talk about, you know, how a lot of these things weren't raised until now for you, that, you know, now you were talking to your father in a different way because you had children, you realize that this book was really a gift to the both of you, a gift to him in recognition of that, of his life, really, and a gift to you in allowing you to make sense of a lot of things that you had probably lived with for a long time, but not talked through. So, you know, what an amazingly mutual experience it was. So one last question.
Can I just add one thing in there, is that I actually knew a lot about my parents' lives and their reflection on it than perhaps many other children of survivors, like not necessarily in a linear fashion, not necessarily in depth. So I had sort of jigsaw pieces around. It wasn't a blank slate by far not.
No.
So that's one thing I want to say. And the other thing is, it's for my children and the next generations and the next generations. And for my children, for my niece and nephew. Again, it's not a linear memoir. It's not a biography. It's all these other things mixed in. But within all of that is the story of my dad. And also, very importantly, I hope it's also a memorial for the various family members who I list there, which for some people may not be interesting. And I flew, here we go, and there's Chacha this and Chacha that and all of this, but it's there. And that was part of my balance. What is interesting for my family as a legacy? On the other hand, what is interest perhaps with other people? I didn't want to go, this is version 1 and this is version 2 and write for 2 different audiences.
I think you did very well, because it's all fascinating. You asked the question that I think will occur to most readers of the book, particularly those who are reading it now from our time and experience. How did my parents in Munich manage to live among the German people, you ask? Your father called it polite distancing amongst the students.
No, I called it.
Oh, you called it. Sorry.
Yeah, it's like what I called, but what he described, that's how I labelled it.
Right. There was civil and superficial interaction, you write. Your father said, we said things like, please pass the test tube or the beaker during cracks. They didn't ask us where we had been for the last few years, and we didn't ask them. Very, very powerful observation. It's fascinating that a kind of unspoken protocol existed that allowed both sides of that experience to get on with their lives. The young Jews to coexist with the perpetrators, or perhaps the neighbours, friends, children of the perpetrators of a recent genocide, and for the German students to continue their studies without being paralysed by existential questions of guilt. And yet many years later, you write that the only real failure amongst the reunions of the Jewish Student Union was the one in Germany, positing that it was the location that doomed it. You also write brilliantly about the ongoing awareness of Polish collaboration during the war. So very deep wounds there in the Jewish community. My play, Berlin, recent play Berlin, focused on the question of forgiving and moving on. So I did a lot of thinking and reading around that. But the more I thought about it, the question of should we forgive and move on felt irrelevant. It's not perhaps a moral question so much as simply a matter of what humans are capable of. Can you talk a bit about what time brings or fails to bring you and perhaps your father, in as much as you can tell, in terms of healing, forgiving, and moving on?
Okay, as I alluded to earlier, my father has always had a very sunny personality. My father also what's called has always been a chevra man. He's a people person and loves people around, all sorts of people. My father, so whatever their background and whatever their ethnic group or country of origin, my father found all people interesting and joyful to be with. And that came especially through his years as a pharmacist here in Melbourne, in Richmond, where many people of all different ethnic groups came, and he was open to speaking to everybody and anybody. And there were German customers, there were customers from all over Eastern Europe. He loved talking to them, and he picked up languages like this so he could speak. He was the Czech one, he was the Russian person, and German specifically. He loved speaking German, and he still enjoys the language. So that's one thing. And my father, he's never been someone to hold this huge grudge against someone who's not had nothing to do with it.
Right.
Definitely, my father always had that. Someone born after the war, it's not their story. But there was always a bit of a sense, you didn't always want to ask what their grandfather or their father was doing back then.
Yeah.
There was certain, I'm not going to say it's like meeting someone German was the same as meeting somebody else. There was a hesitation. And this person is a lovely person, they're interesting, but what was their grandfather doing in the 40s or their father? There's a hesitation.
Yes. Well, yeah, my mother said the same thing when going to Europe after the war, of walking the streets in Berlin and not wanting to calculate the ages of the people she was passing. We could talk about that for hours and many other things, but in lieu of that, I would recommend everyone buy the book immediately and read it, because they won't regret it. I just finished by saying that Jeremy Veron, who we heard from earlier, who lit the fuse to this narrative with his own book, compares Gift of Time to Maus, Art Spiegelman's iconic description of his father's survival, writing that you play, quote, ethnographer to the entire voyage, recording its moments of tenderness, terror, triumph, exhaustion, frustration, humour, and grace. I couldn't put it better, so I haven't. Thank you to you and to your dear father, David Prince, for collaborating on this wonderful contribution to our understanding of history, family, time, and the Holocaust. It's an absolute pleasure to launch this wonderful book and to congratulate you both on the tremendous conviction and dedication you have had in realising it. And I'd like to have a little toast to you, Frances. I hope people watching have a
Mine's
drink.
a toast.
This is a COVID toast. We just have to imagine the joy, the hugs, and the conviviality.
Thank you. L'chaim, everybody, for life.
Thank you, L'chaim, L'chaim. And what a riveting conversation. Wonderful questions invoking great responses. Frances is a historian and an educator, and her expertise on the Holocaust combines wonderfully with her lived experience growing up with survivors as she tackled these questions. So thank you again, Frances, for this book, this gift. What a beautiful gesture it was, how rich the rewards that came to you for taking the time to sit with David and learn. The book is a gift on so many levels, a gift to your family, to other survivors and their families, a gift to those interested in the survivor students, and really a gift to anyone who wants to learn a bit more about the Holocaust. And of course, where can you get it? That's what everyone's asking. So Thesaurus Books in Church Street, Brighton, our friends at the Avenue in Glen Huntly Road, Elsternwick, also direct from Frances's website, www.francesprince.com. And I'd like to thank Joanna Murray-Smith for the insightful conversation. We're so grateful to you for putting so much into this. You've really brought out so much with those searching, deep diving questions. And I'm sure anyone who hasn't already got the book will be rushing out to get it and very eager to read it. I want to especially also thank my team, especially Aviva Weinberg, who coordinated this event, and Robbie Simons, our talented digital media producer, who always puts so much into making these events such a success. And I really want to end by thanking David, who before COVID was a long-time regular presenter to students. And I know that thousands and thousands of students and others who met him will not forget that experience. And that's the important work that we do here at the Jewish Holocaust Centre, sharing survivor stories. And we're still doing that online right now, including survivors talking to students online. And we'll continue to do that on a much bigger scale when we open this building, our new building next year. In addition to that, the educating of students, one thing that we're really passionate about is educating the general public, and with events like this and many more. So please go online to jhc.com.au and register with us so that you can get information about future events coming up. So thank you all for joining us. Please stay safe and stay connected, and we look forward to welcoming you in our new building next year. Thank you all. Good night.